Sir, your right-hand man sold you out. Be careful.
Walk with me.
The silver spoon in my hand reflected a nightmare. Behind the most powerful man in Seoul, his loyal right hand was sliding a digital tracker into his collar while signaling a hit squad outside. I had 5 seconds to decide: stay invisible and watch a murder, or risk my life to save a man who didn't even know my name. The steam from the hand-ground Arabica rose in swirling ribbons, disappearing into the dark, oak-paneled ceilings of the gilded crane. Mia Alvarez adjusted her white apron for the 5th time, her fingers icy from the weight of the secret she carried. At 23, Mia was a master of being a shadow, a ghost with a rehearsed smile working double shifts to pay for her brother's medical bills. But today, the air in the bistro felt heavy. Lee Hyun-woo had arrived. In the city's underworld, his name was a death sentence. For months, Mia had served his table, moving like a piece of the furniture, silent, unimportant, and completely beneath his notice. He never realized that while he was watching the city, Mia was watching him. Mia knew the world of these men intimately. It was the same darkness she'd spent her whole life running from. But as she watched Nam Dae-sung, Hyun-woo's most trusted advisor, betray his boss in a heartbeat, Mia realized her invisible life was over. She couldn't run anymore. She stepped toward the table, the porcelain pot trembling in her hand, and prepared to deliver the most dangerous cup of coffee in Seoul. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The golden light of the gilded crane was designed to make the powerful feel at home and the desperate feel like intruders. As Mia moved through the dining room, she focused on the rhythm of the floor, the clink of heavy silver, the hushed murmurs of men deciding the fate of shipping lanes, and the soft scuff of her own orthopedic shoes. To the patrons, she was a nonentity, a living extension of the mahogany furniture. This was her greatest protection. Behind her neutral, rehearsed smile, Mia's mind was a racing engine of calculation. She wasn't just a waitress. She was a student of linguistics and human behavior, currently on a forced sabbatical from her degree. Every tip she pocketed was mentally divided. 40% for the rent of their cramped apartment near the docks, 50% for her brother Mateo's grueling dialysis treatments, and a meager 10% for the textbooks she studied by candlelight after her shift ended. Mateo was the reason she had perfected the art of the invisible observer. He was only 19, with eyes that still sparkled with dreams of becoming a musician, even as his body failed him. To keep that spark alive, Mia had to be a ghost in a world of monsters. She had learned to read the room like a tactical map. She knew which guests were likely to leave a larger tip if she anticipated their drink refills without being asked, and which ones required her to disappear entirely into the shadows of the pillars. Mia, stop daydreaming and clear the appetizer plates at table 6. The floor manager's voice crackled with impatience. She nodded wordlessly, tucking a stray strand of dark hair behind her ear. As she reached table 6, her sharp eyes caught the glint of a gold signet ring on a hand she didn't recognize, a new player in the city's hierarchy. She noted the tension in his shoulders and the way he checked his watch every 3 minutes. To anyone else, it was just nerves. To Mia, it was the unmistakable signature of someone waiting for a signal. She moved with a fluid, practiced grace, her presence so unobtrusive that the men at the table didn't even pause their conversation as she leaned in. They spoke of liquidation and unforeseen vacancies, as if they were discussing the weather. Mia's heart hammered against her ribs, the weight of her secret life pressing down on her. She was a scholar among thieves, a sister among wolves. Every day was a gamble, a tightrope walk between the life she wanted and the survival she was forced to endure. She just had to make it through one more shift, one more night of being nobody, until the debt was paid and Mateo was safe. But as the heavy front doors swung open to admit the night's most dangerous guest, Mia felt the air in the room turn to ice, and she knew that being invisible was no longer an option. The temperature in the foyer seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment the heavy oak doors swung open. A heavy, expectant silence rippled through the restaurant, starting at the host's stand and washing over the elite diners like a physical wave. Lee Hyun-woo stepped into the light, moving with a controlled, predatory elegance that made the air feel thin. He didn't look like a man who broke the law. He looked like a man who owned it. His dark suit was a masterclass in understated power, and his eyes, cold, observant, and weary, swept the room with a gaze that stripped away every lie. Mia stood at the periphery, her hands clasped tightly behind her back, her breathing shallow. As Hyun-woo was led to table 4, the seat of honor, his usual entourage fanned out with military precision. Leading them was Nam Dae-sung, the boss's right-hand man and oldest confidant. Dae-sung wore a smile that was too perfect, a mask of loyalty he had worn for a decade. He pulled out Hyun-woo's chair with practiced deference, leaning in to whisper a report into the boss's ear. But Mia wasn't looking at the boss. She was watching the reflection in the polished brass of the service station. While Dae-sung adjusted his cufflink with his left hand, his right hand dropped for a fraction of a second, 3 fingers tapping a rhythmic code against the side of his thigh. Mia's stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. At the far end of the bar, a man in a nondescript gray jacket, a man who had been nursing a single glass of water for an hour, tilted his head and mirrored the gesture. It was a signal, a confirmation. As Mia moved forward to take the drink order, her perspective shifted. The luxury of the bistro dissolved, replaced by a battlefield. She saw the way Dae-sung leaned away from the boss just an inch too far, creating a clear line of sight for the man at the bar. She saw the digital bulge of a tracker being surreptitiously smoothed into the lining of Hyun-woo's discarded overcoat. Every loyal gesture from Dae-sung now felt like a shroud being draped over a condemned man. Hyun-woo looked up as Mia approached, his dark eyes landing on hers with a sudden, unnerving sharpness. For the first time in 8 months, he didn't look through her. He looked at her. Mia felt the weight of the coffee pot in her hand, a fragile ceramic weapon, and the even heavier weight of the note she had hidden in her pocket. The table of death was set, and she was the only one in the room who knew that the king's greatest protector was about to become his executioner. The air at table 4 felt thick, saturated with the scent of expensive tobacco and the unspoken threat of violence. Mia's hands were steady as she approached, a cold, clinical calm settling over her that only came when the stakes reached their breaking point. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a courier carrying a message that would either save a life or spark a war. Hyun-woo was deep in conversation with a city official, his movements relaxed, entirely unaware of the viper leaning over his shoulder. Dae-sung was laughing, a warm, resonant sound that made Mia's skin crawl. It was the laugh of a man who had already spent the inheritance of a dead friend. As Mia leaned in to place the coffee, her world narrowed down to the white porcelain saucer and the man sitting before it. She could feel Dae-sung's eyes on her, sharp, suspicious, watching for any deviation from her usual service. She had to be perfect. She lowered the tray, her movements fluid and practiced. With a slight, intentional tilt of her wrist, she placed the cup. The saucer clinked softly against the mahogany. Beneath the curve of the ceramic handle, tucked into the narrow space where the cup met the rim, was the scrap of paper. It was small, torn from her order pad, with 7 words written in frantic, jagged script. Hyun-woo didn't look up immediately. He reached for the handle, his fingers brushing against the paper. Mia felt her heart stop. This was the moment. If Dae-sung saw it, she was dead. If Hyun-woo ignored it, they were both dead. Time seemed to dilate. She saw Hyun-woo's thumb stall. He felt the texture of the paper, rough and out of place against the smooth bone china. Without breaking his conversation or shifting his gaze from the official, he pulled the cup toward him, using his palm to shield the saucer from Dae-sung's line of sight. Mia stepped back, her lungs burning as she finally allowed herself to inhale. She retreated toward the shadows of the service station, her eyes locked on the boss. She watched the exact second the realization hit him. Hyun-woo's posture didn't change, but his eyes, those dark, unreadable depths, went glacially cold. He didn't look at Dae-sung. He didn't look at the bar. Instead, his gaze drifted slowly across the room, cutting through the luxury of the bistro until it found Mia. The message was delivered. Your right-hand man sold you out. The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. Hyun-woo took a slow, deliberate sip of the coffee, his jaw tightening as the betrayal sank in. He set the cup back down with a click that sounded like a hammer being cocked on a pistol. The trap was no longer just for him. The game had changed, and the ghost, Waitress, had just handed the king his sword. The dining room continued its oblivious hum, but for Mia, the world had shrunk to the narrow, charged space between her and Lee Hyun-woo. She turned to retreat toward the kitchen, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she hadn't taken 2 steps before a hand clamped around her wrist like a vice. The grip wasn't violent, but it was absolute. Hyun-woo didn't look up from his table, yet his fingers were a band of heat against her skin, a sudden and startling jolt of electricity that seemed to snap through her entire nervous system. It was an intimate, dangerous contact that made her breath catch in her throat. "Waitress," he said, his voice a low, vibrating chord that barely carried past their immediate circle. He stood slowly, the movement fluid and terrifyingly calm. Beside him, Nam Dae-sung blinked, his practiced mask of loyalty flickering with a momentary confusion. "Boss? Is something wrong with the service?" Hyun-woo ignored him. His focus was entirely on Mia. He leaned in close, his height looming over her, forcing her to tilt her head back. The scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain clung to him. With his free hand, he reached into the saucer, retrieving the crumpled slip of paper with the grace of a magician. "The check," Hyun-woo murmured, though his eyes told a different story. "There's a discrepancy. Walk with me." He didn't wait for an answer. Still holding her wrist, he led her toward the shadowed alcove near the wine cellar, away from the prying eyes of the dining room and the increasingly frantic gaze of Dae-sung. The moment they were behind the heavy velvet curtain, he spun her around, pinning her gently but firmly against the cool stone wall. His face was inches from hers, his dark eyes searching her features with a cold, terrifying intensity. The shock of his touch was still vibrating through her, a mixture of fear and an inexplicable, magnetic pull. "How do you know?" he whispered, his voice like the edge of a blade. He held the note up between 2 fingers. "Look at me, Mia. You've been a ghost in my restaurant for months. Why haunt me now?" "I saw the signal," she whispered back, her voice trembling but her gaze holding his. "The man at the bar. The tracker in your coat. Your right hand isn't guarding you, Mr. Lee. He's marking you for the kill." Hyun-woo's jaw tightened, his thumb subconsciously stroking the sensitive skin of her wrist. The unexpected electricity between them deepened into something heavier, a shared recognition of the abyss they were both standing over. For a heartbeat, the boss wasn't a monster, and she wasn't just a waitress. They were 2 people caught in a sudden, lethal storm, and the only thing holding them steady was each other's grip. "If you're lying," he said, his breath ghosting over her lips, "there is no place on earth you can hide from me." "And if I'm right," Mia countered, her bravery flared up like a dying ember, "you have exactly 3 minutes before that hit squad comes through the front door." The silence in the wine cellar lasted only as long as it took for Hyun-woo to process the truth in Mia's eyes. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that was shattered not by words, but by the distant, muffled sound of the restaurant's front doors being kicked open. Hyun-woo reacted with the speed of a man who had spent his life expecting the sky to fall. He didn't let go of Mia's wrist. Instead, he yanked her deeper into the shadows of the alcove just as the first deafening crack of a high-caliber rifle tore through the velvet curtains. The elegant hum of the gilded crane vanished instantly, replaced by the bone-chilling symphony of shattering crystal and the high-pitched screams of the city's elite. "Stay down," Hyun-woo commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rasp. He reached into the small of his back, drawing a sleek, matte black pistol. From their vantage point behind the heavy drapes, Mia watched the world dissolve into a cinematic nightmare. Nam Dae-sung, the man who had stood by Hyun-woo for 15 years, was no longer cowering. He stood in the center of the carnage, calm and composed, as 3 men in tactical gear moved past him. Dae-sung didn't look like a protector anymore. He looked like a kingmaker. "Search the back." Dae-sung's voice rang out, devoid of its usual warmth. "I want his head on the table before the police even get the 911 call." Hyun-woo watched his brother through a gap in the curtain, his jaw set in a hard, jagged line. Mia could feel the tremors in her own legs, but as she looked at Hyun-woo, she saw something more terrifying than the gunfire, a cold, hollow realization. The man who had shared his bread and guarded his back had orchestrated this slaughter with the clinical precision of a butcher. He's not just selling me out, Hyunwoo whispered, more to himself than to her. He's burning it all down. A shadow fell across the velvet curtain. One of the gunmen was approaching the alcove, the barrel of his weapon leading the way. Mia's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she looked at the dead end of the wine cellar. There was no way out, and the man she had risked her life to save was now trapped with a waitress who had nowhere left to run. But as Hyunwoo's grip on his weapon tightened, he looked at Mia, not as decor, not as a witness, but as his only chance at survival. The service tunnels, Mia breathed, her voice a ghost of a sound. They lead to the docks. But we have to move now. The curtain was ripped aside. Hyunwoo fired twice before the gunman could even level his sights. The roar of the shots in the confined space was blinding, and as the body slumped to the floor, Hyunwoo grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her into the chaos. The trap had sprung, the brother had become the monster, and the only way to survive the night was to trust the girl who had spent her life learning how to disappear. The smell of gunpowder and expensive cologne was quickly replaced by the damp, metallic scent of the industrial kitchen as Mia pulled Hyunwoo through the swinging double doors. Behind them, the sounds of chaos were muffled but persistent, shouts in Korean, the rhythmic thud of tactical boots, and the occasional, chilling crash of more glass. Mia didn't hesitate. While the hit squad likely expected them to head for the grand foyer or the valet entrance, she pivoted toward a narrow, unmarked door hidden behind a stack of stainless steel crates. This was her world, a labyrinth of linoleum and fluorescent hum that the kings of the city never deigned to notice. This way, she breathed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She led him into a service corridor, so narrow their shoulders frequently brushed. The walls here were lined with exposed pipes that hissed with steam, and the floor was slick with the residue of 1,000 shifts. Hyunwoo followed her closely, his presence a heavy, radiating heat at her back. He moved with a silent, lethal grace, his weapon raised, but he deferred entirely to her lead. In this maze, the boss was the outsider, and the waitress was the guide. They passed the industrial dishwashers, their massive maws silent and eerie in the dim emergency lighting. Mia counted the turns in her head, left at the linen chute, right past the walk-in freezer. She knew every loose floorboard and every flickering bulb. She had walked these halls when her feet ached and her mind was filled with Mateo's medical charts. Now, she walked them to stay alive. Suddenly, Hyunwoo reached out, his hand catching the crook of her elbow to pull her to a halt. He pressed his back against the wall, gesturing for silence. From around the next corner, the beam of a flashlight cut through the dark, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. Daesung's men had found the service entrance. Mia felt a flash of cold panic, but she forced herself to look at Hyunwoo. In the shadows, his eyes were two chips of obsidian, focused and fierce. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "The next exit," he whispered. "How far?" 20 feet, she replied, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Behind the trash compactor. It leads to the loading docks." Hyunwoo nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. He stepped out from the wall, the silhouette of his iron grip resolve shielding her. "On my signal, you run. Don't look back." As the flashlight beam swung closer, Mia realized that the invisible girl and the fallen king were no longer just running for an exit. They were carving a path through the heart of a betrayal, bound together by the narrowest of hallways and the highest of stakes. Under the flicker of a dying light bulb, she took a breath and prepared to sprint into the dark. The cold rain of the Seoul night felt like needles against their skin as they navigated the labyrinthine alleys of the city's forgotten district. Far from the polished marble of the Gilded Crane, the air here was thick with the scent of wet charcoal and frying oil. Mia led Hyunwoo up a rusted, skeletal fire escape that groaned under his weight, until they reached a narrow window on the 4th floor. With a practiced shove, she slid the frame open, ushering the fallen king into her world. The apartment was so small it felt like a submarine. The walls were thin enough to hear the muffled cough of a neighbor and the rhythmic thumping of a distant train. Hyunwoo, still holding his weapon, seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. His tailored Italian suit, now torn and stained with grease, looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of peeling floral wallpaper and stacks of secondhand textbooks. "Stay away from the window," Mia whispered, her voice cracking with exhaustion. She didn't turn on the lights, allowing only the neon blue glow of a nearby pharmacy sign to illuminate the space. Hyun-woo's gaze traveled across the room, landing on a small, partitioned corner. There, amidst a hum of medical equipment, lay Mateo. The boy was asleep, his face pale and translucent, his thin arm connected to a dialysis machine that ticked with a slow, expensive rhythm. Nearby, a wooden table was covered in meticulous ledgers, every one accounted for, every meal sacrificed for the next treatment. The boss's eyes drifted to a shelf where a single, wilted flower sat in a glass of water next to a photograph of Mia and Mateo in happier times. He looked at the mountain of past due notices pinned to a corkboard, then back to the girl who had saved his life. In the high-stakes world of the syndicate, Hyun-woo understood power, but he had never understood the crushing weight of this kind of survival. He saw the kindness that had driven her to risk everything, not for a bribe or a promotion, but out of a desperate, quiet love for the only family she had left. "You live like this," Hyun-woo murmured, his voice stripped of its usual iron. It wasn't a question, it was a realization. Mia didn't look at him. She was busy checking the monitors on Mateo's machine, her movements tender and practiced. "This is why I'm a ghost, Mr. Lee. In your world, people kill for a throne. In mine, we just fight to see tomorrow." She turned to find him watching her, his expression unreadable in the blue light. The unexpected electricity from the restaurant was still there, but it had shifted into something deeper, a bridge between two worlds that should never have met. Hyun-woo reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he let it drop. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the city felt poor, and the waitress who had nothing looked like the strongest person he had ever met. In the silence of the slums, the king found his sanctuary, and a new kind of loyalty was forged in the shadows of a dying neon light. The sanctuary of the slums offered a brief reprieve, but by dawn, the cold air of the city felt like a sharpening blade. Hyun-woo stood in the center of Mia's small kitchen, his silhouette framed by the flickering blue neon from outside. He had spent the night watching the rhythmic ticking of Mateo's life support, a silent testament to the stakes Mia faced every day. Now, he looked at the small USB drive Mia held, the digital evidence she had scraped from the tracker's encrypted signal while he slept. "It's not just a coup," Mia whispered, her eyes dark with the weight of what she'd found. "Daesung didn't just sell you out to a rival family. He's been funneling your logistics data to a Russian syndicate for months. He's been liquidating your assets to buy his way into their circle." Hyun-woo's jaw tightened, the controlled fury returning to his gaze. He didn't just want the throne. He wanted to sell the kingdom. They didn't return to the headquarters with an army. They returned with the truth. The syndicate's main office was a fortress of glass and steel, currently buzzing with the false mourning of a man who thought his predecessor was dead. As they stepped into the penthouse boardroom, the air went dead silent. Daesung sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, surrounded by the family's lieutenants. He looked up, the color draining from his face as if he were seeing a ghost. "Boss," Daesung stammered, his hand reflexively darting toward the concealed holster beneath the table. We thought the restaurant." "You thought the restaurant would be my grave," Hyun-woo interrupted, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the room. He didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he gestured to Mia. With steady hands, Mia stepped forward and plugged the drive into the room's central terminal. The massive screens on the wall flickered to life, displaying bank transfers, encrypted emails, and a signed contract with a Russian broker, all bearing Daesung's personal digital signature. The room erupted in a low, dangerous growl from the lieutenants. The betrayal of a brother was one thing, but the sale of the family to foreign interests was a sin that even the most ruthless men could not forgive. Daesung looked around the room, realizing the walls were closing in. He looked at Mia, the waitress he had dismissed as a piece of decor, and saw the girl who had dismantled his empire with a coffee saucer and a sharp mind. "You should have looked closer at the people serving you," Daesung, Hyunwoo said, stepping toward the head of the table. They see everything. As the lieutenants rose to seize the traitor, the final confrontation wasn't one with bullets, but with the cold, undeniable light of the truth. Hyunwoo stood tall, no longer just a mob boss, but a man who had been saved by the very world he once ignored. Beside him, Mia stood her ground, her gaze fixed and unfaltering, finally stepping out of the shadows for good. 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a new corporate headquarters, one that overlooked the Han River rather than the dark alleys of the docks. The air here didn't smell of gunpowder or desperation. It smelled of fresh rain and expensive stationery. Mia stood by the window, no longer wearing a polyester Waitress vest, but a sharp, charcoal-gray blazer that mirrored the quiet authority she had earned. The transition hadn't been easy. The syndicate's old business had been dismantled, replaced by a logistics and security firm that operated in the light. It was a cleaner organization, built on the intelligence and observational skills Mia had once used just to survive. She was no longer a ghost haunting the corners of a restaurant. She was a partner, the strategic mind that kept the new empire steady. A soft chime from her desk alerted her to a video call. It was Mateo. He looked healthy, his cheeks full of color, calling from a specialized music conservatory in Switzerland. The medical bills that once felt like a noose around Mia's neck were a distant memory, replaced by the sound of her brother's laughter and the sight of him holding a violin instead of a dialysis tube. "You're pensive today," a low, familiar voice rumbled behind her. Mia didn't need to turn to know it was Hyunwoo. She could feel the unexpected electricity that still sparked between them, a hum of energy that had deepened from survival-born adrenaline into something enduring and warm. He stepped up beside her, offering her a cup of coffee, black, hand-ground, just the way she liked it. "Just thinking about how a single note in a saucer changed everything," Mia replied, her hand finding his with an easy familiarity. Hyunwoo followed her gaze out toward the city. The man who had once been a monster to the world now looked at her with a gaze that held only respect and a fierce, protective affection. He had traded his throne for a partnership, and in the process, he had found something he never knew he was missing: a conscience. "It wasn't just the note, Mia," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "It was the girl brave enough to write it." In the shadows of their old lives, they had built something new, a legacy of peace born from the ashes of betrayal. The shy waitress and the reluctant boss had found redemption in each other's arms, proving that even in a world of wolves, the most powerful weapon was a voice that refused to be silenced. As the city hummed below them, Mia realized she was no longer running. She was exactly where she was meant to be,